Tequila.
As we gather this evening to commemorate historic violence from 80 years ago, we do so in the shadows of recent violence just days ago and now last night. We ask you, therefore, to stand and join us in remembering these individuals whose lives were taken from us in acts of racist, anti-Semitic, and misogynist hatred. Tom White, Rabbi Amy Lowenthal, and I will read their names, and after each group, we will pause in silent respect for their lives. While we do not know the names or the reasons, if any, for those who were targeted last night in California, we stand with their loved ones and honor their lives as well. From Jeffersontown, Kentucky, we remember Maurice Stallard, Vicki Lee Jones.
From Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rubinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irving Younger,
from Tallahassee, Florida, Nancy Van Vessem, Maura Binkley.
And for those whose names we do not know in Thousand Oaks, California. Thank you. Please be seated.
Good evening, and welcome to the Colonial Theatre. I'm Alec Doyle, Executive Director. I'd like to start by acknowledging and welcoming some of our guests tonight, including Mayor Kendall Lane, Keene Fire Chief Mark Howard, right there, and Police Captain Stephen Stewart, as well as Elsa Worth with the Keene Interfaith Clergy Association. I'm going to guess that also Jay Kahn is here, our state senator as well, and welcome him, as well as other distinguished guests, and perhaps most importantly, you, the public. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the Abenaki people on whose heritage ground we gather tonight. On behalf of the Colonial staff and board, we are honored to again be the host for this important event. In our primary role as a performing arts center, we are in a fortunate position in that we typically engage the public at their best. When I say best, I mean that they're sharing in a universally humanizing experience that arts provide. And those experiences bond all of us by both revealing and reinforcing our similarities. Tonight we serve a different purpose. We ask you to look squarely in the face of that which wants to divide us through the amplification and exaggeration of our differences. This is the 11th year that Colonial has had the privilege of partnering with the Cohen Center. For me, it seems like it's about a year, but it's been over a decade. And given the prevailing toxic atmosphere that I think we've all been experiencing, it's tempting to say that tonight's message is uniquely relevant, and it is in its way. But looking back over the past decade, it's clear that that is only half of the truth. The urgency of our message was also critical in years past, just as it is tonight and will continue to be in years to come. Progress has been made, but the work isn't over. The work is never over. That is why your presence tonight, this audience, is profoundly reassuring. And for that, I thank you.
Historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote, "The genius of America lies in its capacity to forge a single nation from peoples of remarkably diverse racial, religious, and ethnic origins. It is important to remind ourselves that in troubled times, America has offered the promise of hope, of a fairer and more just way of life. Democracy, however, is never guaranteed and requires eternal vigilance. Germany's Weimar Republic did not withstand Hitler's authoritarian appeal. As a nation, we have been confronting the implications of Nazism and its echoes of racist targeting ever since Hitler was given power in 1933. Hitler sought power by dividing people, by embracing fear, insecurity, resentment, sexism, bigotry, and nationalism. This mixture of authoritarianism appealed to many Americans then and continues to do so now. Coming to terms with that past and connecting it to our present is essential, and why I think we continue to gather in witness and in solidarity. General Eisenhower, witnessing the horror of a Nazi camp, recognized that, quote, "Now Americans know what they are fighting against." Heeding Eisenhower's warning, we continue to fight against xenophobic nationalism, nativism, white supremacy, racism, suppression of civil rights, and the poisoning of truth that threatens our democratic experiment. Our themes tonight, listening to the voices of the targeted, reminds us that to secure the foundations of our democracy, we must first listen to the targeted, the ostracized, and the outcast. Hate and fear of the unknown other, is a human condition that we continually confront. Adolf Hitler was fascinated by racism in the United States. In September 1933, he directed German political and legal minds to wrestle with their so-called Jewish question. Nazi radicals specifically cited the American experience as the world leader in white supremacist legislation. That was before they sent a team to America to study American racial law. It is sobering to learn that when the Nazis arrived, they rejected Jim Crow and the pseudo-legal tricks of disenfranchisement as too radical, too illegal to be a long-term solution for their racial agenda. Instead, the Germans discovered that racism was not limited to the American South. American eugenicists, held in high esteem by their German counterparts, had justified U.S. race-based immigration and marriage laws. Racism was utilized to gain national power. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was followed by the 1921 and 1924 quota system that focused on allowing only Northern and Western European Nordic types into the United States while discriminating against less, quote-unquote, desirable people from Southern and Eastern Europe. This quota system limited the number of immigrants and refugees who could find safe haven in America. It also helped the Nazis formulate their race exclusion laws. The Nazi law of July 14, 1933, the so-called Law for the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases, was directly modeled on the eugenics-based sterilization laws of California. Eventually, the memo Hitler sent in 1933 led to the formulation of a uniquely Nazi law, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. Having said this, it is also very true that Americans learned more and more about Nazi excesses the more and more they heard its troubling echoes. They began to reject eugenic initiatives. Movements like the Double Victory campaign emerged from the Jim Crow South and framed World War II as a campaign for freedom and civil rights at home and abroad. In turn, that fueled the ongoing struggle for civil rights in a post-war America that chose to move forward in an entirely different direction. In other words, Americans learned what was at stake by witnessing and listening to the impact of policy on targeted groups. And so, informed by the past, we continue to fight against xenophobic nationalism, nativism, white supremacy, racism, suppression of civil rights, and the poisoning of truth. America grows stronger due to its diversity. Democracy itself grows and strengthens by listening to the voices of its minorities, who have often guided us with the promise of hope for a fairer and more just way of life. As a quick example, in 1898, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of one Chinese man whose immigrant community had been targeted by mob violence. He argued that even though they were immigrants, they too deserve protection of U.S. law. The Supreme Court ruled against the nativists and the nationalists by concluding that the 14th Amendment protected all persons, not just all citizens. This ruling created what we now know as birthright citizenship. The U.S. is one of 30 countries to do so. And finally, in 1965, Pastor Martin Niemöller, Hitler's only personal political prisoner, warned. First, they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the socialists and the trade unionists, but I was neither, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not a Jew, so I did not speak out. And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak out for me. And so 80 years after the events of November 1938, we come together to be reminded of human failure and also of human potential. In retelling this history, we recognize that there were and always are many moments to intervene. What echoes will we hear? How will it shape our behaviors when we listen to the voices of the targeted from Nazi Germany? Rabbi Eliezer counseled, know from where you came, where you are going, and know before whom you stand. We take the next few moments to remind ourselves that what we permit will happen.
April 7th, 1933. The Nazis have passed a civil service law. I have to retire because my grandparents were Jews.
May 7th, 1933. I am forced to leave the German armed forces because I am a Jew. My father was a decorated hero in the Great War.
July 14th, 1933, the Nazi Party has become the only legal party in Germany. Jewish immigrants from Poland were stripped from their German citizenship.
October 4th, 1933. The new law called the Editor's Law is now keeping registries of racially pure newspaper editors and journalists. The Ministry of Propaganda has returned to the World War I phrase, fake news, to attack any paper unfriendly to the Nazis. Many reporters have fled the country. And other newspapers seem to be limiting their stories to those approved by the Nazi Party.
June 28, 1935. I have been arrested under a revised German law because I am homosexual.
September 1935, Nuremberg laws. Hitler has decreed that Jews, Negroes, and Gypsies have alien blood. Their rights have been restricted, and they will not be allowed to date or marry Germans.
July 16, 1936. Gypsies, the Roma and Sinti have been rounded up and sent to a sewage dump outside of Berlin in preparation for the Olympic Games.
August 28, 1936. Jehovah's Witnesses are in Germany and they're being arrested because they refuse to swear loyalty to Hitler. They are being sent to concentration camps.
December 14, 1937. A new decree has been passed that people can be arrested for engaging in criminal behaviors even if there is no evidence. They will be sent to the concentration camps for an indefinite period.
1937, the United States. About 72% of Americans support support the anti-lynching bill. Congress refuses to vote for it. Since 1933, 77 people, almost all of them, Black Americans, are lynched.
Early 1938, Stefan Louis. It's the day of my bar mitzvah. The German police come to take away my father. He was a veteran for Germany in the First World War. Turns out they were giving him a medal. The greatest gift that I received that day was seeing my father return home safely.
April 1938, the United States of America. A public opinion poll in the United States has just revealed that about 76% of Americans think Germany would be better off if it drove Jews out. 67% of Americans want all refugees kept out of the U.S.
July 6 through 15, 1938, Evian, France. 31 countries, including the United States, have met in Evian to discuss the Jewish refugee problem and have decided not to ease the restrictions on immigration. Only the murderous dictator of the Dominican Republic has opened his borders, but nearly no one wants to risk going there.
Why do we remember Kristallnacht? The simple answer, Kristallnacht was a turning point in the history leading to the Holocaust. We remember the lives that were lost, 6 million Jews, 1.5 million of them under 12, and 5 million other targeted populations, among them Roma, Sinti, Seventh-day Adventists, homosexuals, Freemasons, and the handicapped, not to mention those others that the Nazis designated as expendable and unworthy of life. We remember them to say to ourselves and to the world, their lives mattered. Their lives counted then, they count now. Our world is diminished by their loss. We remind ourselves that turning points continue in the present. We are called to recognize them and act, knowing what may be at stake. We can, of course, prepare by identifying telling factors, crucial components, significant indicators of approaching thresholds and choices. We can be informed. We can test our vision and learn to recognize important features in the moral landscape. We know that how we treat others who are different is one such factor. We know that another is how we treat refugees and immigrants. We know this by remembering what happened then. We forget that at our peril, even if the connections are not always as clear as we might wish. And we know the terrible cost of anti-Semitism then and now. But most of us don't actually remember what happened then because we were not alive then. Instead, we study what we don't remember so that we can know what happened then that did not happen to us. And so we remember who we are, so we can be responsible in the present for one another. We remember what we have learned because it was and remains important. We commemorate with one another, for our children, for the sake of the world we pass on to each other. We all know that this work can be discomforting. It is unsettling. In one sense, it is meant to be. Historian Michael Rothberg calls it empathic unsettlement, with the emphasis on unsettlement modified by empathy. Tonight, we commemorate the memory of others who have borne witness on their behalf and on ours. Their witness calls out to us. It calls us out of ourselves into presence with others, with one another, into presence with history, and with the present, not to mention the future. We are called by the memory of others, summoned to bear witness to what happened then, and sadly to what is happening now. We are summoned to responsibility. We are summoned to know before whom and with whom we stand, to borrow words from Rabbi Eliezer of blessed Jewish memory. In that sense, each year when we gather here, we do so to remember who we are. We recall who we are. We summon ourselves into presence before a painful and shameful past, presence in the face of a fraught world and a painful time, presence before a beckoning and challenging future, presence. And for whose sake? For one another's, and most especially for our children's. The house in which we gather, literally and figuratively, is in many ways our children's house. Joy of cooking, A band from 1971, another fraught time, put it poignantly then. This is our children's house. They wait outside the door. They're listening to our voices, learning what we think we're here for. Do we know? Can we tell them, as our own fathers live out their lives, we must repair somehow, or be haunted by our children's cries? Do we know? Can we tell them? This is our children's house. Indeed, this is our children's house, this time and place. We do what we do for their sake, for them and for one another. We accept our responsibilities for the past, for the present, and for the future, and for Tikkun Olam, repair of the world. May it be so. Let it be so.
Each year, representatives of the city of Keene choose this occasion to publicly rededicate ourselves to serve, protect, and minister to all members of our community. As we just witnessed in the video, most public officials in Nazi Germany looked away or followed orders not to intervene during the events of November 1938. So tonight, informed by the witness of these events, we seek to further the common good and strengthen the bonds of our community. We envision Keene as a strong, just, and resilient city where the health and well-being of Keene and the people who live, play, study, and work here are nourished and supported, where our residents work together and participate in meaningful civic life. Therefore, we choose to remember.
The mission of the Keene Fire Department is to provide levels of excellence in emergency, prevention, education, and community services to minimize the loss of life and property damage due to fire, hazardous materials, medical, and other emergencies in an efficient, professional, and fiscally responsible manner. We serve our community and are responsible as professionals and individuals for our actions. Therefore, we choose to remember.
The mission of the Keene Police Department is to protect life and property and to maintain order within the city while assuring fair and respectful treatment of everyone. As members of the Keene Police Department, we commit ourselves to being capable, caring people, doing important and challenging work for the benefit of all citizens within our community. Therefore, we choose to remember.
The Keene Interfaith Clergy Council brings together people of various faith communities for common purpose in social action and prayer. We look to our faith to lament the sins of the past and to work together for justice in the future, remembering the words of Isaiah 43, "You are my witnesses." Therefore, we choose to remember.
The Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies advances the public liberal arts mission of Keene Stage College through Holocaust and genocide education, inspiring students and other citizens to take responsibility for promoting human dignity and civic responsibility while confronting the escalating violence that leads to atrocity and genocide. To this end, the Cohen Center joins the campus community and its many partners in promoting an active and informed citizenry committed to mutual respect and justice. As we choose to remember the night of broken glass, we remind ourselves to care for one another, to renew our commitment to compassion, hospitality, and justice. Please join us now as we recite together, we remember. The text is inside your program. As together we say, we remember that night as a moral obligation to the victims and the survivors, as well as for ourselves, for the sake of our children and for our community. We recognize our responsibility to care for others in our midst who might be overlooked, targeted, or victimized in their circumstances. We remember so that individuals may refuse to become perpetrators, bystanders, or collaborators. We remember in hope that present and future generations take responsibility for building a world free of anti-Semitism, bigotry, intolerance, and hate. Therefore, we remember Kristallnacht to remind ourselves to care for one another, to build peace, and be a community in which compassion, respect, and justice thrive.
We light this candle as we recall with bitter grief the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, and to remember the countless Roma, Sinti, handicapped, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Poles, and others who were targeted and destroyed by the Nazis and their collaborators. May we never be numbed, indifferent, or complacent to the magnitude of this horror. In honor of their memory, strengthen our commitment to make a difference and to never forget.
We light this candle in memory of the 1.5 million Jewish children and all children whose lives were taken from them by the Nazis and their collaborators before they had the opportunity to live. In their memory, we commit ourselves to all children in the world they inherit.
We light this candle to remember the plight of the refugee who has been forced to flee because of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. May this candle remind us to open our hearts and minds to those who, in desperate need, seek safety and a place to call home.
We light this candle in honor of those compassionate men and women who, at the risk of their own lives, saved Jews from the Holocaust. In the midst of the most frightening reality, they made room for their Jewish neighbors. We honor Elizabeth, a Hungarian teenager who rescued her 5-year-old neighbor, Kathy Preston. May the memory of these righteous individuals guide us in helping others and creating peace and justice in our world.
We light this candle to remember the life and sacrifice of Keene's Jonathan Daniels and all people of conscience who answered the call to work for civil rights in our nation. May his courage help us to recognize our responsibility to protect the human dignity by responding to racism and bigotry. May we be inspired by the knowledge that the actions of a few can change the direction of many.
We light this candle to inspire us to continue to build a resilient community in which respect and justice thrives. May we be welcoming and never forget our responsibility to others who are marginalized. Not for what they have done, but because of who they are. We recognize that when any one of us targeted, wounded, or humiliated, all of us share the burden of responsibility.
El Male Rachamim, the memorial prayer for the 6 million. I invite you to rise to join me in reading the English text on page 3, in the middle. El Male Rachamim, God, full of mercy, you who dwell in the heights, shelter them beneath the wings of your presence, high among the holy and the pure who shine like the brilliant heavens. Shelter them. Shelter the souls of our sisters and brothers of the house of Israel who were slaughtered in the Shoah, small children, women, men, strangled, suffocated, burned to ash. They revered your name. Their souls passed into your care. Let Eden be their resting place. Master of mercy, drape them and keep them forever in your protecting presence. Bind their souls to the living and to life. God, you are their inheritance, where they rest. Ease them with peace, and we say, El Male Rachamim, Shochen Bameromim, Amatzem Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei HaShekhinah, במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל שנטבחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם. בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אנא בעל הרחמים הסתירם בסתר כנפך לעולמים. וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם. ונאמר אמן.
I was asked to speak tonight to not only introduce my upcoming musical number being performed, but to answer the question, why art? Yes, why art indeed? For after all, art is not necessary. We don't require it to live, to breathe, to cure us from disease. But why then have I, and so many others, dedicated our lives to it? As artists, we are oftentimes ridiculed, dismissed, underpaid, and rarely valued. Yet with all that, my life feels empty when I cannot pursue it. In those times, I find myself feeling lost, empty, scared, and even victimized. Is that normal? I ask myself far more than I care to admit, and I recently came across a quote that helped in part to explain my feelings. It says, "Art is not a mirror to hold up to society, but a hammer with which to shape it." Yes, that made perfect sense to me. Because whenever I create or complete a work, I feel like I am contributing to the beauty of the world. I feel like I'm offering our flawed domain some form of perfection, or at least my vision of perfection, and that gives me peace. So getting back to that original quote, art is not a mirror to hold up to society, but a hammer with which to shape it. I find it to be consistent with my current project. I wrote a book about 4 years ago about my grandmother's time as a German Jewish teenager during World War II. But rather than focusing on the cruelty and horror and destruction of those times, I just feel that there are already more than enough contributors to that these days. I instead chose to make it an uplifting and profound expression of the moments she and her family endured during the darkest days of human history. The family always maintained their humanity, their hope and heroism, and were the epitomes of the triumph of the human spirit. Their love conquered and survived against all odds. They were beautiful inside and out, and fair and kind, and they are and always have been my vision of perfection. So it was obvious to me that they needed to become art. But soon after the book was released and attained great success and circulation all over the world, I felt they needed to evolve from off the pages of a book and out of the imagination of the readers. They were not nearly done shaping our ever increasingly flawed domain. They still had more to do, and they still had more beauty to contribute to the world. And so I adapted the book into a play, more specifically into a rock musical. The instruments, notes, chords, and voices I selected to express their lives, loves, and losses made them appear larger than life. Right before my eyes, they became influential, inspirational, and undeniable. We need that. The world needs that. When I first began giving talks 4 years ago, I spoke more about genocide as a concept and the ways in which to recognize and oppose it on a human level. My story happened to be about a Jewish family in the late 30s and early 40s, but there was a bigger, more universal narrative that needed to be told. But now, on November 8th, 2018, I find myself having to address more specifically the looming presence of anti-Semitism. It is amazing how quickly things can change in such a short amount of time. But if change for the worse can come about so quickly, then I also have to believe that change for the better can too, can't it? Well, that is my hope, and that is my vision. So now you are about to see John Andriani and the MoCo Arts Dancers perform a song from my musical entitled, "Oh God." It is when my grandfather is forced to leave the love of his life behind in a concentration camp, only to enter a cattle car filled with other men en route to the death camp Auschwitz. My hope is that the beauty of the melody and words transcend our differences, that you see before you not a Jew, but merely a man who in his darkest hour questions if God has forgotten him. For if my art can convey that our differences are far lesser than our similarities, then it has truly manifested itself into a hammer and is shaping our world in a far better direction. That is my wish. That is my intention. And thank you for listening.
Should I slip away in the dark of night?
As a musician, I just want to say that was lovely. I was just really moved by the way that the piece ended with this kind of repeating pattern, which kind of makes us feel like it's kind of like the marching of history, and that was beautiful. Kristallnacht, what does it signify? I can only say what it signifies to me. I'm the child of two survivors. My mother was 7 years old at the time. She was a reluctant student in Lublin, Poland, in many ways a typical young child of the time. It is unlikely that in 1938, before the German occupation, she would have given much, if any, thought to the violence erupting in neighboring Germany. But my father, a 19-year-old medical student in Vilna, followed the threatening developments closely, and without a doubt, Kristallnacht must have been a key factor in his eventual decision to flee Europe for Palestine. To him, I'm sure it served as a warning, an alarm sounded from just across the border in Germany that life could not be peaceful for Jews living under the Third Reich. To me, Kristallnacht signifies a few things: the breakdown of order, the death of neighborly trust, the specific danger of walking while Jewish in Nazi Germany. Today, Kristallnacht is viewed through the lens of history as a line, a demarcation of where before ends and after begins. But it really wasn't a line, not to the people living through it. It was really part of a much larger, longer, harder to perceive drifting, a slow, erratic, unpredictable, nonlinear erosion of social norms. For example, as early as March of 1933, just a couple of months after Hitler took power as chancellor, conductor Bruno Walter, a Jew, was scheduled to conduct a special concert of the Berlin Philharmonic. But as of January, Jewish involvement in all things cultural, scientific, or academic was being systematically erased. The Nazis called this de-Judification, and it was taken very seriously because it was not simply an effort to eliminate the presence of Jewish influences, but as the Nazi ideology saw it, German culture had been distorted from within by Jewish culture, which, akin to a virus, derived its nourishment from its host. And it needed to be pulled out from the roots and cleared away to allow German culture to recover as its own pure ideal. Bruno Walter was not forcibly removed from the podium of the concert hall. He was not even overtly banned from performing. He was simply advised that if he were to conduct that night's concert, there was a possibility that rogue zealots may just burn down the concert hall. And it was suggested that in order to keep the peace, he should maybe voluntarily withdraw. If the conversation were happening in today's vernacular, he would have been asked to take one for the team. So he did not conduct, and instead he packed his bags and fled Germany. In case you're wondering, the show did go on. Richard Strauss conducted in his place. I mention this example because there was absolutely nothing violent about it. It was essentially a quiet conversation, albeit one that raised the possibility of a fire. What's most confusing and pernicious about the Nazi appeal to Bruno Walter is that it is just that, an appeal, giving the illusion that the conductor has any role to play in the decision-making process. While the events of November 9th and 10th, 1938 were overtly violent
and disorienting. They were absolutely constructed of the same cloth as every other effort by the new German authorities to strip Jews of their positions of first significance and leadership, and eventually simply citizenship and humanity. The acts themselves may look and feel different, but the consistent thread that binds this all up into one recognizable pattern is a foundation of lies. Lies regarding the motivation for the action, lies about the actual decision-making process, lies about the perpetrators, lies about the supposed role played by the victims, and ultimately lies about the possible effects on their future existence. The first time I heard the word perfidious, it was used by my mother to capture the uniquely deceitful, malevolent, and inexhaustible pattern of deception employed by the Nazi German government in almost every act directed at Jews. In my mother's memoir, Dry Tears, she describes how she, her sister, and parents survived the war to emerge as one of only 4 intact Jewish families from Lublin, a Polish city with a pre-war Jewish population of roughly 300,000. In her subsequent 6 books on rescue and resistance during the war, she zeroes in on some key factors necessary for survival under extreme conditions. In her decades of research conducting hundreds of interviews with both survivors and the Christian Poles who risked their lives to save them, she claims to have found not one example of a person who survived the war completely alone. It would seem that our very survival requires mutual cooperation. Furthermore, when she attempted to identify the common characteristics of those who acted to save lives, she was initially puzzled when the usual sociological categories didn't seem to predict who among the Polish Catholic population would act to save Jews. Social status or class, religiosity, urban versus rural, educational background, relative wealth, etc., etc. None of these categories seem to appear in anything remotely akin to a pattern. But slowly, over years of research, she began to discern some factors which lay beneath those more obvious means of categorization. And I think that today, more than ever, it is absolutely essential that we remind ourselves of these 3 factors which consistently appeared in the profiles of almost every righteous Christian Nechama Tech interviewed. Regardless of whether they were leaders or outcasts, most of these individuals were sort of on the periphery of whatever social world they were living in. In some cases, this was the result of extraordinary accomplishment or leadership. In other cases, it was the result of a kind of failed outcast status. But in any case, most of these individuals did not fit easily into conventional social structures, and as a result, they were more free to think for themselves and act accordingly, and they had learned to be their own moral compass. Second, all these individuals had established pre-war patterns of helping. So, for example, if they saw a beggar on the street, they would dig into their pocket or their purse to give them some change. Or maybe in their family, they were the one person who could always be counted on to give an extra help in times of need. In many cases, their pre-war acts were minor, almost inconsequential, like stopping to alert someone that their shoelace is untied, or picking up a bill that had gone floating out of someone's purse, crossing to the other side of the road because a cart is coming in your direction. These are things that are not life-altering, but they show a kind of pattern of an instinct to help and a kind of way of being in the world. And they establish a pattern of behavior, and we are ruled by habits, and they are difficult to shake off. And no matter what the circumstances that suggest we may be better off doing something else, if we're used to doing something one way, we tend to do it that way. Finally, the last thing is that in almost every case, rescuers did not sit down for days or hours even to ponder the pros and cons of whether they should or shouldn't risk their lives to save person X or person Y. No, it just sort of happened. It kind of unfolded. It just kind of found its way into their life. A person showed up in the middle of the night, and what were they going to do? Turn them away? Or a possibility for a camouflaged mode of transport from one city to another suddenly presented itself, and so swiftly, without much thought, arrangements were made to get person from point A to point B. Beyond my mother's research into the subject of rescue and resistance, I think there are some important factors to consider in the way that her father conducted himself socially that may tell us something about human connection and navigating the turbulent water of in times of upheaval. Interestingly, in my father's story, a similar pattern of connectedness being very important emerges. I just want to give you two examples, one from my mother's wartime experience and one from my father's, to illustrate the value of human bonds with acquaintances, co-workers. These are not the kinds of bonds, these are not family bonds. These are kind of more casual bonds. Okay, so two quick examples. As I mentioned at the start of the war, my father was completing his medical studies in Vilna. He was one of 6 Jewish students admitted to his class through a commonly accepted quota system at the time. Although technically, for a year or so after German occupation of Poland, Lithuania was a neutral independent state, anti-Semitism was igniting all over Europe, especially on university campuses, where right-wing allied student groups grew increasingly violent. My father was always curious about people. He just loved to get to know them, no matter who they were or how he met them. And that may be why he ended up becoming a psychiatrist. He didn't shrink me, but he somehow always ended up forming little attachments with people that other people in his world would overlook. One such person was the janitor in the medical school building. My father and the janitor discovered that they had similar taste in women, so they would talk about that. And that they would also talk about music, which the janitor liked a lot. So they would often, in breaks between class, my father would find the janitor and talk. One day, Dad walks into school, and the janitor pulls him into his storage closet and says, the Endics, now the Endics were the right-wing political student group at the time. The Endics are planning a violent action against the Jewish students at the end of the school day today. They're going to be waiting along this path where you have to exit the building with bats and pipes, and they're going to beat the Jews to a pulp. So the janitor begged my father, don't leave the building, stay with me, we'll have a cup of tea, we'll sit and talk in my office, and you can just wait it out. So together they sat and waited and talked, and until they heard sort of the noise dissipate, and then it was dark and no one was out there anymore, and my father was able to leave the medical school building without ending up in the hospital. This is the direct result of his having a relationship with this person. In fact, things at medical school for my dad would get more and more tense and unpredictable once the Germans had defeated Poland. Finally, in 1940, with less than 2 months remaining in his last semester of medical school, my father fled Europe for Palestine. At the time, his Jewish friends in medical school told him that he was crazy to leave without his degree, that he was making a stupid, unnecessary, emotional mistake. Years later, he would learn that not one of them survived the war. The thing is, though, I spent some time in Lithuania making the film Defiance, and in 1939, you would not have expected Vilnius or Vilna to have been the killing center that it turned into, because Vilnius was known as Jerusalem of Lithuania. It was home to one of the largest Jewish populations, and in fact, before my father fled Europe, many of his friends from other parts of Poland were streaming in to Vilnius in hopes of escaping Nazi terror, because Lithuania was neutral. But then, as it turned out, the Lithuanians proved themselves to be extremely enthusiastic co-murderers with the Germans, and it was not a safe place to be. My mother and her sister survived the war with the help of several Polish Catholics, some who sheltered them as cousins from the other side of the country, others who offered help in the form of advice, directions, the name of a contact. Almost every arrangement, situation, journey from one town to another, job, or other piece of the puzzle of her family's survival had been arranged by my grandfather, Roman. Roman was orphaned at the age of 14. My grandfather, who I never met and I am named after, he was a self-made and cunning businessman. At the start of the war, he owned a small but successful candle-making factory in the heart of Lublin. Lublin was Poland's industrial center. By the time the war began, anyone who had been paying attention understood that Jewish-owned businesses in Nazi Germany would swiftly be scooped up and converted into property of the Reich. Kristallnacht had occurred just a little less than a year before the arrival of German tanks and bombs into Poland. One of the most perfidious elements of the design of Kristallnacht involved the subsequent denial of insurance claims filed by Jewish businesses and the legal imposition of severe penalties for business owners who failed to clean up and repair damage done to their storefronts. In another strange example of German deception, with seemingly no purpose other than cruel disorientation, the German government first allowed insurers to process the claims and give the Jewish business owners the money. Then, in a bureaucratic sleight of hand, the government swiftly confiscated all settlement payments, then leaving the Jewish business owners with the daunting challenge of complying with the legal requirement that the shops be repaired. This really amounted to a first step in the eventual confiscation of all Jewish property to support the Reich. My grandfather had always maintained a close relationship with his foreman and with the workers, most of whom were Polish Catholics. His foreman, in particular, admired my grandfather and thought of him as a mentor. He had learned the candle-making business from my grandfather. Upon news of swift Polish military defeats on the front, Roman took the unusual step of arranging for the immediate transfer of ownership of his factory from his name into his foreman's name. By doing this, he shielded the factory from the threat of German confiscation, because the Germans came into Poland and they took anything that was Jewish owned. But if it was Polish Catholic owned, they left it alone. It was understood that this arrangement would be temporary if, at the end of the war, my grandfather was able to return to Lublin and the factory. But when the war did finally end, and Roman and my mother and her sister and his wife, they returned to Lublin after having lived in several different parts of Poland during the war, the factory and the foreman's family invited them to dinner. They were all sitting there at dinner and talking. And it was sort of clear to my grandfather in that moment that not only was the factory not going to be his, not because of any malice on the part of the foreman, but just because of what had happened. The factory was not going to be his, but also Poland was not going to be his. And he decided to move his family on. We don't, unfortunately, get to choose the larger political landscape on which we build our lives. If, as luck would have it, we find ourselves living in a world permeated with mistrust, greed, corruption, selfishness, and danger, we stand a much better chance not only of surviving, but of living and possibly even thriving if we stay open, curious, and invested in the world of people who share our little corner of it. In the daily act of simply meeting our neighbors where they are, we and they might slowly begin to feel a part of something akin to a web. Not a World Wide Web, no, but a local web. One which experience tells us should be durable enough to break our fall and help us right ourselves for the next leg of life's journey.
Good evening. My name is Patricia Perez, and I'm from Chile, a country where 9/11 has a different meaning than the United States. 45 years ago, 45 years since the state of Chile turns against his people. With pain in my heart, my spirit, my struggle are the faces of thousands of men, women, and children that their lives were taken away with a violence that is impossible to understand. Of those who their bodies and souls carry the scars of the brutality of other human beings. Of those who their families were separated forever, and a society that is trying every day to look with conscience and responsibility what happened 45 years ago. On the book 100 Years of Solitude of the Colombian author Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there's a moment where suddenly everybody in the city of Macondo are to either willfully or accidentally forgetting their past and their origins, usually with a terrible and avoidable consequences. Because it's continually been lost, time on the novel is cyclical and repetitive, as generation after generation is doomed to either repeat the mistakes of their ancestors or to fall into spirals of ineffectual and pointless activity. A time machine, and to put labels on everything around them, were some of the efforts to remember their past. In Chile, we lost memory for a long time, and now we are putting labels to our individual memories to create a collective one. Memory is a construction we make in a certain moment. Memory is not past. It's how I and we interpret and give sense to that past in this present moment. We can't change our past, but we can learn from it. That's our challenge and our responsibility. It is difficult to rebuild a broken society on the basis of denial. The preservation of memory does not have the purpose to stay in the past. A cloudless past can gravitate in the present to project a future. Today, I am a 31-year-old woman who has tried to understand how and why this happened in my country. But that is not enough for me, and I hope it's not enough for you either. I want to live in a world where I, as a woman, can feel safe and respected. And if I can't do that, I want others to live in that world. I want to feel proud of where I come from and where I'm going to. But I also want to feel that the pains that we have suffered on this path drives us to change. That way, this will never happen again. Tonight, we are together gathered in a sad commemoration, but I'm also happy. I'm happy because I can see a community committed with the respect of the human rights. I'm happy because when hate and discrimination discourses seek to settle, we got up for the respect, tolerance, and democracy. I am happy because I see students here. I see a younger generation that are trying to fight forgetfulness. I have the hope, and I know that together we are going to be the ones that will make this world better. And today, more than ever, as Allende said 45 years ago, history is ours, and people make history. Thank you.
Thank you for being here this evening. We conclude our commemoration with a candlelight recessional that seeks to symbolically bring the light of memory into our community. We pass the candle of remembrance and hope from one hand to another, from one generation to the next. By standing as witnesses to the past, we become teachers. We choose never to despair, but to instead make a difference. Rooted by this memory, we bring the light of hope into the present and into our future. As the candles light our way, may we remember to teach and act with respect for human dignity and diversity. After the candles have reached the lobby and the front of the theater, we ask you to depart in thoughtful silence.